Hi, everyone. Welcome to Food as Medicine, and thank you so much for joining us. This event is presented by the Food Bank of Santa Barbara County in partnership with the Mosher Foundation. Our goal is to offer free, equitable, evidence-based, and culturally sensitive nutrition education that empowers our community. I'm Kayla Malari, your host today, and the nutrition manager at the Food Bank. We have a very exciting presentation lined up for you. It focuses on nurturing healthy eating habits from toddlers to adolescents. Before we start, I'll just go over a few housekeeping items. So during this presentation, if you have any questions, please feel free to use the Q&A feature on Zoom, and we'll address all questions at the end. We'll have about 10 to 15 minutes for our Q&A session. Your feedback is very valuable to us, so please share your thoughts on this presentation as well as suggestions for future topics. I'll provide all the links in the chat once I pass the floor on to our guest speaker. Additionally, we offer Food as Medicine, the podcast that addresses any popular nutrition questions. You can find it by searching Food as Medicine on your favorite streaming platforms, as well as I'll put the link in the chat. You can access this webinar recording and any previous sessions on the Food Bank of Santa Barbara County YouTube channel. Please allow us a couple of days to upload this specific webinar, but we'll have it up in no time. We'll have a few poll questions during this session, so please participate. All right, so before we begin, a huge thank you to our guest speaker, Amy Isabella Chalker, for putting together this wonderful presentation and sharing your expertise with us today. Amy is a registered dietitian nutritionist on the Central Coast of California, so local to us. She specializes in disordered eating and clinical eating disorders. She guides individuals towards personalized food-body relationships and emotional well-being. So without further delay, I'll hand it over to Amy. Thank you.
Great. Hi, everyone. It's really exciting to be presenting this topic. I love speaking on it, in part because it tends to bring up different questions and thoughts every time I give the talk. And even though the topic is on feeding children in ways that take into account their nutritional health and their mental health and their emotional health, it also touches on all of those aspects of health for parents and caregivers as well. So it would not be surprising if during this talk you have some of your own reactions and memories of how you were fed as a child and how some of those feeding strategies might have impacted you or continue to impact how you eat and feed yourself to this day. So just pay attention to that as we go along and take note of how this might impact you as well. So before we get started, Kayla is going to launch a poll question about just your perception of what the biggest challenge in feeding children might be, what you perceive the biggest challenge in feeding children at meal times would be. So we've put some common things that we hear about struggles with feeding children, feeding families. So just curious to hear your thoughts. And as you consider that, I will share my screen and we will get into it. Okay.
Amy, I think we have the results in.
Hey.
We have about 94% participation, so great job. 35% of folks think the short ordered cooking, so trying to cater to everyone's palate. About 41% getting kids to eat their fruits and vegetables, and then 29% is all of the above.
Okay, sounds pretty evenly split. And these are things that I hear a lot from clients, and also when I give this talk from participants, things that really keep people on their toes, to say the least. There we go. So not as much worrying about weight, but maybe all of the above comes into people or across people's dining room tables at some point. So the good thing about this talk is that it will address all of those, each of those challenges, and we'll talk about how to manage them as parents and caregivers. Okay. All right, it might be a familiar look to some of you that this little boy is giving, the glare across the dinner table. So in order to feed children well, I think I like to start out with addressing and trying to understand what is normal food behavior, right? Because in order to avoid treating normal behaviors as a problem, we first have to sort of identify what is normal, what does normal child behavior look like around food? And it might surprise some of you what is considered developmentally normal and acceptable. So let's take a look. So normal might be eating a lot one day and then eating very little food the following day. And I think it's important to highlight too, of course, we're talking about children, but again, you might see yourself in some of this. And remember that everything we talk about today is to help children grow and develop into adults who have a healthy or positive relationship with food. So you can potentially apply these to yourself as well. It's normal to select just one or two foods at a mealtime, even if there's a wider variety of foods offered or on the table. Very normal to become bored of so-called favorite foods and experiment with new ones. For many children, it's very, very normal to sit at the table but not remain quiet, to be maybe interrupting or playing with their food, maybe making a scene even. Very normal to actually enjoy being at the dinner table or the meal time with others, but then want to leave immediately once the meal is over. I'm sure many of you can relate to that, both personally and perhaps for your children as well. And it's also normal to seldom eat a food the first time it is placed on the table. So if it's a food that's unfamiliar, like couscous or maybe lima beans, a different kind of fruit, it's very normal for a child to not be interested in it or not willing to taste it or maybe even touch it. Not just the first time it's introduced, and we'll go into this a little bit more later in the talk, but maybe for many times that it's first introduced. It doesn't mean that we stop introducing it, as again, we'll talk about shortly, but it is very normal not to gravitate toward a food the first time. I wrote the exception of French fries and sweets because these foods are what we might call hyperpalatable, meaning that they typically have larger amounts of sugar and salt. So those foods tend to be easy to gravitate toward. And once the child has a little taste, it's easier for them to eat them maybe on the first or even second try. Okay. So I present this slide because it introduces a concept that we might struggle with as adults, which is that we are all born with the innate ability to determine our own hunger and fullness cues. So a hunger and fullness cue would mean our own internal ability to regulate our hunger and fullness. So for instance, to know when you need food and then stop when you feel full and satiated. So the offering is that we're all born with this, right? And these two charts illustrate this. So this is actually an infant between the ages of 6 and 9 weeks old. And on the left-hand side of your screen is a chart showing their milk intake over the course of 3 weeks in ounces. So you can see that it varies pretty widely. The first day they've taken in about 27 ounces. The next day it's down to 23. You can see how widely it varies. Some day it dips as low as 21. Other days it goes up to 32. Pretty wide variety. So if you were to look at that, in and of itself, you might be concerned about the baby's intake, particularly on the days when they don't drink as much milk. But if we look at the chart on the right-hand side of the screen, we actually see that the baby grows very expectedly. That's what we want to see, that relatively smooth growth curve up, grows very steadily and predictably over the course of those 3 weeks. So what we take away from this is what matters is the average intake over time, not the day-to-day intake. So this is really important to remember in our talk today, because I'll refer back to this a lot when it comes to children's abilities to regulate themselves. And again, our abilities as adults to regulate ourselves. Even though we're all born with these innate abilities to determine our energy needs through our hunger and fullness cues, they can very easily get eroded over time. So I can only imagine that some of you have grown up in families, maybe many of you have grown up in families where you were perhaps told to take 3 more bites of chicken and 2 more bites of peas before you could leave the table, or that you had to eat all of the rice on your plate before you could have dessert. These are just little examples and well-meaning examples. None of this is malicious by any means by caretakers, but these are all sort of micro ways in which our innate abilities as children to regulate ourselves is overridden by these interventions that tell us how much or how little or what to eat. So this is just sort of a baseline, like I said, that I will refer back to as we go along. Okay, so we're going to talk about something called the division of responsibility. And this is a structure of eating or a way of eating and feeding children that was developed by a registered dietitian actually back in the 1980s. She was sort of ahead of her time in developing this theory about feeding children in a way that would help them have a positive relationship with food as they age and would also help their nutritional health as they age. So it's not just the emotional and mental part, but the nutritional part as well. And the whole basis of this division of responsibility practice is rooted in confidence. And you'll see how that applies as we go along. But essentially, it's confidence in our children to know that they have that innate ability to feed themselves. So knowing that they are born with that innate ability to determine their own hunger and fullness cues. Again, when we sometimes lack the confidence to determine that in ourselves as adults, it can be difficult to offer that to our children. So that's one of the reasons I think that this division of responsibility can be a really helpful frame for feeding children, because it gives us something to refer back to when we might be a little bit unsure or confused about how to feed children. It's just a frame. It's a suggestion for maintaining confidence both in the child, but also in ourselves. So the division of responsibility is actually validated by a lot of clinical research, and I'll present a few of those studies shortly. But each of those studies shows that the division of responsibility lowers nutritional risk in children and instills what we call higher eating competence, which basically, again, means that we trust children to know how much and what and how much food, essentially, that they need from day to day. So what is the purpose? The purpose of the division of responsibility is to give the parent and the child a frame. Again, it's not on regulating the child's intake. So there is a structure to it, which we're going to talk a lot about today, but it's not about regulating how much the child takes in or if they eat or not. probably the hardest part about the division of responsibility, and we'll come to understand why. But the division of responsibility has been adopted as a best practice for by the American Academy of Pediatrics policy for their parenting and feeding guidelines. This was recently reaffirmed in their most recent issue, in their March 2024 issue. The division of responsibility is also included in the basic nutrition education message sent out by the Food and Nutrition Service of the USDA. So we're just going to launch another little poll to check in with you. And just curious to see what you think the responsibilities of the parent are in the division of responsibility. So Kayla's going to launch that. So essentially, which is not a responsibility of the parent or caregiver when it comes to feeding. And you're not expected to know this, it's just your best guess. Okay. And we'll give it a minute because I'm going to answer that question on the next slide. So let's see what you guys think. Okay. All right. You guys have good intuitive skills. How much they eat, exactly, not the responsibility of parents or caregivers when it comes to feeding, which again, in theory, sounds so simple, right? So simple. Just, yeah, the children are responsible for how much they eat. But we'll talk about ways that we both overtly and subtly might try to influence that as parents and caregivers and outsiders. Okay. So I lied. I said the next slide I would tell you more about the division of responsibility, but I just wanted to mention the research that I alluded to previously. So there are a lot of studies that have been done on why consider using the division of responsibility. Part of what you'll learn today is that family meals are one aspect of the division of responsibility, and I'll start calling it the DOR just to shorten it. But with the understanding that family meals don't mean the same thing for everybody. And I'm going to talk a little bit more about that as we get more into the DOR. But there is a significant relationship that studies have shown between more frequent family meals and better nutritional health. And that's across all aged children, all countries, all socioeconomic statuses. A separate study shows similarly that regular family meals are associated with lower rates of depression, anxiety, substance abuse, eating disorders, tobacco use, early teenage pregnancy, kind of the whole gamut, as well as higher rates of resilience and higher self-esteem among children. So pretty profound when it comes to family meals. The next study is suggesting that parents who set limits, and again, not limits about how much we eat, we know that by now, right? But limits, and we'll talk about what these other limits are. Parents who set limits rather than providing free access to foods at home are offering children more structure and guidance. And if you have ever watched TV shows like, I don't know if you remember the TV show Super Nanny that used to be on. I used to love that show. It talks about how children thrive with some kind of frame in place, right? So it doesn't mean necessarily super rigid. It doesn't mean that we don't make concessions for things shifting from day to day and individual needs, but children thrive under some kind of frame. And this DOR, this division of responsibility, is one such frame. And that the suggestion is that children thrive on this level of, or this kind of frame, this level of support and guidance in order to facilitate healthy eating habits. And then similarly, or kind of on the other end of the spectrum, the next study finds that pressure to eat, this study was done on mothers, There haven't been as many studies done on fathers, but I'm sure that would be interesting. Pressure to eat by mothers was associated with greater eating in the absence of hunger in boys. This study was done on boys specifically. And then the last study on here suggests similarly in girls that girls whose mothers reported using higher levels of restriction when their daughters were 5 ate more in the absence of hunger as they aged than those whose mothers used lower levels of restriction. So when we talk about pressure to eat or restriction, we're basically talking about overriding those innate hunger and fullness cues that I had discussed earlier. And we're going to go now more into depth on what that looks like. Okay. So finally, the division of responsibility. What is it? And I put this big black line in the middle just to really drive home the actual division part, what the parents are responsible for and what the children are responsible for. So parents are responsible for feeding, and there's a distinction between feeding and eating, okay? So parents are responsible for the feeding part, the what, the when, and the where of meals and snacks. This is going to vary a little bit, of course, as children get older. Adolescents have more freedoms. That's understood, but we'll, make that distinction as we go along. But in general, parents responsible for the what, the when, and the where of meals and snacks. Children, in turn, are responsible for if they eat at all, and how much they eat. So again, really simple in principle, much more difficult in practice. There's a lot of things that get in the way of allowing these two separate and distinctive ways of approaching food to occur naturally. So let's explore them in a little bit more detail. So we're starting with the parent side, and we'll start with the when. Especially when we're talking about younger children who rely pretty fully on parents to supply the meals and the snacks. They typically need food more often than we as adults need food. Again, it's going to be very different from child to child, and you know your child best. So if feeding every 2.5 to 3 hours is a goal range, you might notice your child needs food every 2 hours because that's how often they seem to be hungry, or they're very, very active, or you know your child well. So you'll adjust this based on what you've noticed your child requires. But the overall goal is to have some sort of, as we said, structure or frame. So if it's every 2.5 to 3 hours and that's the frame, great. Again, remaining consistent, but with enough flexibility for different days. Of course, the child's going to have a different school schedule or a different activity schedule. They might be at a play date at somebody else's house. So you're not going to be necessarily hitting this to the hour every single time. But the intention is just to provide consistency and to let the child know, and especially to let the child's body know, that food is going to be arriving on a regular basis. This helps children tune in to their own hunger needs much more readily, right? So if food is served more or offered more erratically, if there is no frame, then the child doesn't really know when to expect food, and the child's body doesn't know when to expect food. And so there tends to be more of a sort of, when food is offered, more of a potential binge-like quality to eating. So let's say food is offered every 2 to 3 hours one day, and then every 5 to 6 hours the next day, and then every 8 hours the next day. There's not an expectation for when food is coming, so that when food is offered, it's usually eaten much more quickly in a much more kind of erratic way, and it makes it a lot harder for children to check in with their own hunger and fullness. As adults, we can probably relate to this too. If we don't give ourselves food on a regular basis, then we wait all day to eat and then come home ravenous after work, for instance, foods. We probably have noticed these qualities in ourselves. We probably eat a lot more than we would otherwise. And that's not a willpower thing. That's our bodies actually trying to get what they need, but it comes out in a much more erratic way. So we can help children begin to establish this at a pretty young age. So the second part of the parent responsibility is the where your child eats. Again, ideally, we want to eat as a family or in a group as much as possible. And this is because of, remember the research slide that suggests all the positives that come from eating together. But this doesn't necessarily have to mean proverbial sitting around a kitchen table having like 3 courses. That doesn't have to be what it is. Like you can see in this picture, they're sitting around a coffee table, maybe even watching a show on the laptop. What matters is the being together and the ease with which the meal is happening. So ideally, it's not happening while parents are discussing, stressful topics or things that don't involve the child. It's an opportunity to model for the child what an easeful meal can be like, and also an opportunity to model for the child what just trying foods looks like. Remember, the child's not necessarily going to be mimicking exactly what you're eating or how you're eating, but they pick up on these things unconsciously. And so over time, they're much more likely to develop their own relationship with food as they see what's modeled. So again, does not have to be at the dining room table, doesn't even have to be at home. If you eat out more, or you're going to somewhere, a restaurant after work, because that's just what's easiest, you're still all eating together. You're still eating in a group setting. And that's really what matters, more than exactly where you are, or that everything is so, quote unquote, perfect when it comes to the family meal. And then we turn to the last parent responsibility, which is what is offered. One part of the what is the offering to serve the food family style, or what we might call buffet style. Again, your table does not have to look like this table. This happens to be a very pretty picture, but I would say 99% of us do not create this kind of a buffet for our families or ourselves on any regular basis. But the purpose of offering food buffet style or family style is to remember, going back to that slide of the baby who eats a lot more milk, or drinks a lot of milk more one day and less the next day. A buffet style allows children, especially as they get a little older, to serve themselves amounts of food that they think are appropriate for them. They're going to mess this up. I just want to say that right off the bat. When they start being able to serve themselves, they're probably going to fill, half their plate with rice. They're going to take 3 slices of bread. They have no idea. But this is how they learn. This is how they learn what's appropriate for them, for their bodies. So food doesn't necessarily have to sit on the table like this. It might be in the dishes that it was cooked in, on the kitchen counter or the stove. And younger children, of course, are going to need more help serving themselves. But the idea is to start giving them some autonomy about how much they take onto their plate, right? So you as the parent or caregiver are still choosing the what. You've planned the menu, and we'll talk about that in a minute. But you're starting to give the child autonomy about the how much, which is the other half of the division of responsibility. So serving family style or buffet style can be a really interesting experiment to help the child develop their own sense of what's enough for me, and help them develop that level of autonomy. So the menu itself, and I know a lot of you on that initial survey suggested that one of the biggest challenges was meeting the palates of everybody at the meal, right? Trying to cater to everybody. So one suggestion with respect to the division of responsibility is to center the menu around what parents enjoy. not making separate meals for everybody. So not making the meatloaf for the parents and the hot dogs for the child, which it's a lot of short order cooking, right? It makes the parent or caregiver's job much more complex. So the offering is to not make separate meals, but include at least one quote unquote safe food for each person that goes with the meal. So what does that look like? So let's say the main dish is going to be meatloaf, for instance, and you're not sure how your child is going to react to meatloaf. They might like it, they might not, but you know they love macaroni. So you might make the starch of that meal macaroni. And then you might serve some peas on the side as the vegetable. You are pretty certain that everyone at that table is going to be able to eat some macaroni with butter. Everyone has shown their love for macaroni. Maybe it's macaroni and cheese. If that's something that you know, everyone at the table will go for. But the goal or the intention is to include some kind of food that you know the person will eat. Doesn't have to be a whole meal that they'll eat, but one food. So basically that there's not two main dishes. And the frame for creating such a meal is basically just that there's some kind of grain. So this is just an example of a tamale. The grain being the corn around the tamale, some kind of protein, whether an animal or vegetable protein. So that's either going to be beans, in this case, beans or chicken or pork or ground beef. And then some kind of non-starchy vegetable or fruit. So in this case, it's like a pico de gallo salsa. It could be a side of fruit or fruit salad. It could be a salad. It could be beans or green beans. But basically, those components plus a fat. In this case, it could be avocado. Maybe the meal has been cooked with oil. Maybe there's sour cream on the side, so some kind of fat. So as long as these components are part of the meal, this gives children the best opportunity to manage their own hunger and fullness cues. So if we leave out the fat, for instance, for any reason, because we're, I don't know, concerned that our children are eating too much fat, or we leave out the grain because someone in the family is trying to be keto, or we leave out the vegetable because we're afraid no one's going to eat the vegetable. Each little exclusion is eroding our children's abilities to determine their needs for themselves. So if you've ever had a meal that lacks a fat, for instance, I would imagine that it's a little bit more challenging to determine how full you are, or if you do feel full, maybe it's because you've had a lot of like voluminous foods like fruits and vegetables filling up your stomach. But then you might be hungry like an hour and a half later because the meal doesn't have a fat in it, so you don't feel as satisfied. Same for children. It makes it a lot harder for them to tune in to their hunger and fullness cues and be able to trust their hunger and fullness cues. So with snacks, I'll just mention, typically we would offer two different foods for the snack. So that's both to not overwhelm the child with choices and also to simplify life for you, the snack provider. So two options and rotating those options, which you can do with meals too. Doesn't have to be a different snack every single day. You might have the same snack 2 or 3 days of the week and another snack the other 2 or 3 days of the week. But you can use a similar principle for designing snacks. Ideally, that it has at least 3 of these 4 components in the as you compose it. So maybe the snack doesn't necessarily have a fruit or vegetable, but it has some kind of protein, grain, or fat. So maybe it's peanut butter crackers, for instance, or maybe it's cheese with some kind of like melted on bread, or tortilla, or wrapped in tortilla, or something of that nature. It can be really basic. It can look like a mini meal. Sometimes I've seen people serve peanut butter. I'll sometimes suggest this, that they serve like a peanut butter and jelly sandwich cut into quarters as a snack because it's really easy. It includes all the components, grain, fat, and protein. And if you cut it into quarters, it gives children the opportunity to determine when they've had enough. So they could have 2 quarters and be done. If they're hungrier, they might have all 4 quarters and be done. Just one really easy way to make a meal into a snack. Okay, so I'm just going to present a couple challenges. So for instance, what if you have multiple children and they all like different foods? So we talked a little bit about this, right? At the dinner table, when you're putting together a meal, the ideal way to manage this is to serve at least one food that everybody likes. And if they say, oh, I don't like, the meatloaf today, it's a really good way to teach children to manage within themselves disappointment and to say, I know that's really disappointing that we don't have hot dogs today. I'll take that into consideration for another meal this week. And then you can have hot dogs the next night. But it's a really good way to start to get kids used to having foods that they don't love, or to allow them disappointment to not have foods available that they're actually going to eat. Another challenge, and this is more a challenge for you as the parent, I hear this a lot, but I don't have time to prepare a perfectly healthy, composed meal. And remember just that it doesn't have to be something that you've made from scratch. Like for instance, if you served popcorn and hot dogs and apple slices, that would meet your requirement for that. Remember when we put together that meal on the plate, it has a starch, you may put butter on the popcorn. So you've got your starch, your fat, some protein in the hot dog. I don't know why I'm saying hot dogs so much today, but it just comes to mind because children love hot dogs, and apple slices as the fruit or vegetable. So it does not have to look like what you might think of as like the perfect meal. Our bodies respond the same, whether we're getting a carb from popcorn or a carb from the dinner roll or a carb from the rice. It can look like a lot of different things. So don't put too much pressure on yourself to create something that looks the way you might think it should look. You can put together a really healthy meal with popcorn, hot dogs, and apples. Okay. These are just some ideas to, again, remember going back to the idea of frame and how important it is for children to have some kind of structure and boundaries, even as they're developing their own autonomy, right? So these are just some assurances that you can give children when they are struggling with not having their favorite food on the table, not liking the main dish, and having maybe little meltdowns with these. And or saying, that they're hungry between meal times and snack times. There's certainly the urge to provide food in between the times that you've set. If a child comes to you and says, I'm hungry, that's one way to handle it. It's not like it's wrong to give children food when they say, I'm hungry. But if you want to kind of help them establish, again, a structure that allows them to check in with their hunger and fullness cues and eat more at the meal times and snack times, you can experiment with saying, hey, I realize you're hungry because you ate, you didn't eat as much at dinner, but we're going to have snack time in an hour and a half, and you can have more then. You can try that, see how that goes. You might be surprised how quickly children adapt to eating on more of a schedule when you do that. Again, make sure that it works for your family. If you know they're starving and they're about to go have a sports practice, please, by all means, do not, deprive your child. But it can really teach them to get on a schedule if you experiment with eating mostly during meal times and snack times. You can reassure them that they don't have to eat anything that they don't want. They come to the table, they see the meatloaf, and they're like really bummed out and be like, yeah, you don't have to eat that. Look, there's macaroni, help yourself. There's rolls and butter and help yourself. You can just reassure them, they're not going to be made to do anything they don't want. They still have to use their manners, ideally, saying yes, please, and no, thank you, learning not to say yuck if they see meatloaf and going, ew, yuck, gross. It's okay to correct them and teach them other ways to say, no, thanks, I'm not going to have that, thanks. Reassuring them that there is always going to be something that they like and that they can eat as much of that as they want to. They want 3 servings of macaroni, great, have that. That is perfectly okay. And I'm sure that's bringing up some concerns in some of you. Well, what if they just eat macaroni and cheese for the rest of their life? We'll talk about that in a minute. So when there is a new food on the table, if you are introducing something like, I don't know, couscous or kale or something that they've never seen before, you can say, I know you don't recognize this, but there's always going to be something that you recognize and that you like. It just provides an extra level of comfort and safety and allows children more opportunities to get used to there being new foods on the table. Similarly, there's always going to be a favorite dish. Sometimes it's going to be somebody else's favorite dish. It's going to be your sister's favorite dish, your mom's favorite dish. But there's always going to be something that you like on the table. Okay, so that was all parents' responsibility. It's a lot of responsibility. These are the child's responsibilities, okay? If they eat or not, and how much they eat. Okay, that's it. That's their responsibility. Also a big responsibility, bigger responsibility of the parent to let the child take this on. Okay, so because we have all these fears, right? What if they don't eat enough? So remember, going back to that very first or second slide about the infant, we are born with the ability to eat enough when we have all the other pieces in place. So when there's a food or when there's a meal that has all the different components, including at least one component that we know the child likes taste-wise, they're going to eat enough. When there is enough structure and a lack of distraction, they're going to eat enough. And if they don't, their bodies are going to make up for it. Just like that graph, on the day that the baby drank 21 ounces of milk, if you noticed, generally the next day, it had more. It had like 28 ounces the next day. And then it had, 25, and then it had 32. So enough might look very different from day to day. Enough isn't necessarily going to look like eating the same exact amount every day. And that's where sometimes we run into issues as adults too. Like some people will track their calories and they'll try to keep it at exactly, 2,200 calories every day. But what we don't take into account is that our bodies need different amounts of energy from day to day for reasons that are sometimes invisible, that it's not necessarily about if we worked out or didn't work out that day, that our bodies are undergoing all of these individual or invisible processes inside that tell us how much we need and from day to day. The same is true for children. And if they're allowed to be in touch with that, their bodies will regulate it themselves. Same is true for adults. We tend to have a harder time getting in touch or re-in touch with those hunger and fullness cues because they've been eroded over time by society, by well-meaning parents and caregivers, by diet culture, by a lack of access to food sometimes. There's a lot of things that can interfere with our abilities to be in touch with those things. But if we can provide as much consistency as possible and stick with our part of the division of responsibility, the child is going to get enough on the average. Remember, not necessarily day to day, but week to week, month to month, year to year. Another potential fear, if they're not required to, they won't eat their fruits or vegetables. So one of the bigger, and you guys said this on the poll response too, that there's a concern. So what if kids don't eat their fruits or vegetables if we don't get them to? And I think we start to run into trouble when we think of it in terms of getting. Like, has anyone ever been able to get you to do something that you don't want to do? It's really hard, right? Um, Fruit and vegetable intake is stressed by, every doctor, every dietitian, because they're important. But are they important to eat every single day for the rest of our lives? Is that going to affect our health in a significant way? Not necessarily, because if we allow children to gravitate to fruits and vegetables on their own time without pressure, and without making them into something that they have to quote unquote get through in order to get to the good stuff, then we're kind of setting up this hierarchy, right? Like, okay, you have to eat your beans in order to have the cookie. And we're doing that. I mean, certainly a cookie is more palatable than beans. Like, that's pretty much a given. But we are setting up even more of a hierarchy sometimes, the way that we frame the fruits and vegetables compared to the dessert, or like, eat 3 more bites of beans and you can leave the dinner table. So beans or whatever the vegetable is, becomes this thing that you just have to get through to get to the good stuff. And so we set up potentially a negative connotation. Whereas if the fruits or vegetables are presented with everything else on the dinner table and without pressure, there's a much higher likelihood that children will start to gravitate to them naturally. Are they going to eat as much of their lima beans as they do of, butter and rolls? Probably not, but they don't need as much as they do carbohydrates. We need more carbohydrates than we do vegetables. So that's a good thing. And children know that inherently on an unconscious level. Remember in the research studies that it showed that pressure to eat actually has the opposite effect. So that if we're trying to cajole or trick even kids into eating their fruits and vegetables, or negotiate eating fruits and vegetables, it usually has an opposite effect. And often these are children who might grow up with a greater aversion to eating fruits and vegetables when it's imposed on them or used as a reward system. It might sound really backwards, and it can be really hard to sit at the table and watch the child go through meals without even touching a fruit or a vegetable. But if you're able to experiment with it and see what happens over the course of days or weeks, you might be really surprised about how willing children are to try new things, even fruits and vegetables. Similarly, there can be a fear that if you implement the division of responsibility, that children are only going to eat like this one mono food, like cereal over and over, or macaroni and cheese over and over, or dinner rolls and butter over and over. But I want you to think about yourself. Like, if you go on vacation and you indulge in a lot of maybe richer foods than you typically would, or different kind of fun foods than you typically would at home, 90% of the time when you get back, I hear clients say, oh, all I want is just like a fresh salad and some protein. Like, our bodies crave what they need. The same is true for children. They might, especially if the division of responsibility is something that's new or a newer idea to your family, and they haven't had unrestricted access to food like this before, they might very well overdo it. And by overdo it, I don't mean do something wrong, right? Because if you're restricted from a food for a period of time, absolutely your body is going to want more of it than it typically would. And so there is likely an adjustment period where they might eat more macaroni or more cereal or more bread and rolls and butter than they typically would. And that's okay. Because if you think of eating like a pendulum, and you let the pendulum swing back and forth, right? It doesn't just stop on one end or the other end. It always settles in the middle if you allow it to settle in the middle. If you hold a pendulum on one side and then let it go, it doesn't just swing to the middle, right? And stop. It swings equally as far in the other direction, and then it swings a little less far and a little less far until it settles in the middle. This is a really good image to keep in mind for feeding children and for feeding ourselves when it comes to experimenting with something like the division of responsibility, because there will likely be an overcorrection in the beginning. And maybe even on other days when it's a particularly palatable food. If you serve French fries, everyone's probably going to eat more French fries than they would of like rice or potatoes or regular potatoes because it's so hyper palatable. But if we let children have the amount that they need, they will naturally start gravitating to the things that their body is missing, just like we do. Just like we do. If we go periods of time without having something fresh or something maybe lighter, our bodies crave it. It's inherent in us if we kind of let ourselves, let our bodies do what they need to do. Okay, let me see. How are we doing on time? Okay, I'm going to just roll through these last few slides. I want to mention dessert because dessert, again, we've been talking about some hyper palatable things. Dessert has a higher concentration of sugar. It is harder to self-regulate sugar. That's true for children. That's true for adults. One of the ways to manage this is, and this is one of the exceptions in the division of responsibility, you can limit the amount of dessert. Okay. So you can say when, you can limit the amount. I often recommend serving it with the main food because it takes away the hierarchy again, not, that you have to finish your beans before you have the cookie. Have the cookie first. If you're having one or two cookies, it's not going to interfere with your ability. We worry about ruining our appetite. One or two cookies is not going to ruin our entire appetite for dinner. Just try it. Try serving it with the main dish, see what happens. It's just an offering. How children learn to eat new foods. There are plenty of studies that show that children won't try a new food up to 20 or 30 times of seeing it on the table. So they might need to see you eat it many times. They might need to have it on their plate, but not eat it. They might need to lick it. They might need to pick it up, put it down. It can take many, many opportunities for them to see that food before trying it. And going back to the slide of what's normal, that's normal. Watching you, the parent or caregiver, eat the same food with enjoyment and introducing these new foods without commentary, without pressure. You can answer questions and say, oh, we got, or maybe you got it together at the farmer's market that day. Or they ask, what's this? And you can say, oh, we grew that in our garden. That's asparagus or whatever. But not saying, try it, give it a try. Just introduce it, see what they do with it, see how they interact with it. They're much more likely to take it in at some point. I'm gonna just roll through this really quickly. You can have, hopefully you'll have the replay of this to look at more closely. These are just different mealtime challenges and ways that you can potentially accommodate things like the child being done before the rest of the family and wanting to leave the table. Things like they ask for more food immediately after the mealtime ends. And these are all just potential ways to mitigate that, or I should say manage that more within yourself, but real strategies that you can implement, because children are children and they have less attention span than adults. They have less capacity to tolerate emotions than adults. And these are all normal things as well. So I won't go through every single one, but you can take a look at those on your own on the replay as well. Implementing the division of responsibility, ideally you're implementing it as a whole, but you can try experimenting with things like, for instance, serving the dessert with the main meal or serving the food buffet style and just seeing what happens. And children challenge rules. That's what they do. That's normal. If they're younger, the transition is going to be easier. If they're 10 years old or 12 years old and you're trying this for the first time, it might be a little harder. It might take, a bit more practice for everybody. And older children have more autonomy. So there's going to be potentially more pushback and maybe a greater transition time to adjust to something like this. Little ways that we as parents and caregivers might add pressure when we don't mean to. You might serve the salad first to try to get the child to eat their fruits and vegetables. Remember, we can't get people to do anything they don't want to do. Eat this, it will make you strong. You get a prize if you eat it. Oh, just try a little bite. Oh, but I made it with so much love. I put so much effort into it. These are all well-meaning, well-meaning. Nobody's offering anything, saying anything malintentioned, but these are all pressures that, again, remember the research. Kids who experience pressure usually from mom, because studies haven't been done as much on dad, but they probably should be. Kids who experience that pressure tend to ignore their hunger cues more as they age. That's the reason, not because we don't care about kids getting fruits and vegetables, not because we don't care about eating things that will make our teeth and bones strong, but because all of these little micro pressures tend to get children out of touch with their hunger and fullness cues, which lead to more nutritional risk and deficiency, and even obesity down the road. Okay. And if you just try one thing, just if the only thing today that you take away from this is just consider experimenting with a meal where you don't offer commentary on the child's eating. Talk about things totally unrelated to food or eating. I guarantee you it's going to be a lot harder for you as the parent or caregiver to restrain yourself from interfering than it is for the child. And that's just something really interesting to pay attention to in ourselves and think about how we were fed. And these are usually the parents and caregivers and individuals that I work with in my practice who have experienced this from their own upbringings, and just really interesting, brings up a lot. Okay. All right, I have some resources here and my contact information. I'm sorry I didn't leave so much time for Q&A, Kayla.
That's okay. Thank you, Amy. That was wonderful. I learned a lot, honestly, even for myself, as you mentioned. Like, am I an adult child? It looks like. Um, but thank you. I really appreciate that you mentioned like there's a structure and a framework, but also offering the flexibility. So thank you so much for that. Before we jump into the session, I think we can hang on for a couple of minutes. But again, just thank you for joining. And then here is the QR code if you're able to share your thoughts and participate in the feedback. Truly, it's just to make our program better, as well as you can suggest any future topics that you would like to see. And so please go ahead and put some questions in the chat and we'll hang out and you all can ask some questions to Amy. We have one. We're going to answer it live. What are your thoughts around having the child help make the snacks or the food?
I think it's wonderful. I think involving children in making the meals is another way to expose them to new foods. So even if they're not interested or willing to eat the foods right away, it's another exposure. So remember those like 20 or 30 exposures, and that's a little on the high end. Sometimes it's only 10 or 15, but it's one way to expose children to foods, new foods, and get them involved and more curious and interested. It's a little different if there's already like disordered eating. I work with a lot of eating disorders and disordered eating, so I would answer that question differently for that population. But for children who are just learning to eat, I think involving them in meal prep is awesome.
Thank you. Any other questions? And if you all want to come off mute, I can also allow you all to talk if there's interest in that. I have a question. just how do you balance? I think you talked about like the innate eating and intuitive eating, as well as, kind of the focusing on the parents' responsibility of when. And I think that could be kind of tricky. So just, I think maybe you did mention it, but just kind of reiterating how best to have both of those be true in a sense.
Yeah. So ideally for especially young children, so we're talking like toddlers and elementary school age, it is ideal to have three meal-like things and three snack-like things throughout the day. And that doesn't have to be three sit-down meals, like I said, that you put together like courses, or it could just be like six eating times, let's call them, per day, just to make sure that kids are getting the regular opportunity to eat, and then always expecting, or knowing when they're going to have more. So it could look like taking, an English muffin to school in the car. That might be breakfast. And then having, snack at school, either that's provided by the school or that you bring in a little baggie, and then of course lunch usually at school, and then a snack after school, some kind of dinner, whether it's takeout or restaurant or at home, and then ideally another snack before bed, which sounds like a lot of eating, but for children who have high energy needs and who do often require that level of like expectation that food is coming on a regular basis, it can be really reassuring and helpful for hunger and fullness cues.
Thank you. We have another question from Greg. One way we try to keep our 4-year-old at the table is reading from a joke book. Should we just accept that they don't want to be at the table?
It's a great question. Um, Four is sort of that like almost like cutoff point. Um, it's really what's working. If your child is like, if the book is working, I think that's great. I think it's a great way to just keep them engaged, and also to make mealtime fun, right? Like we were talking about, just keeping mealtime light. You're not talking about heavy things. You're not talking about homework or grades or finances. Like you're talking about fun, light things. So I think the joke book is great if your child's engaged. If they're like just trying to push you away and they're just like, I just want to go play, I just want to go play, they can go play. Try again at 5 years old. Maybe they'll be more ready to sit at the table, but keeping it light, I always support that.
Thank you. And I'm assuming maybe with age, the time to sit at the table might grow.
Exactly, and it's different for each child. Like some children at 4 might be totally like engaged and want to stay. Others are like, absolutely not, I'm out of here. And only your child.
Thank you. Any other questions? I think we're over time, but if there's any last minute questions, we'll happy to answer them. One question, how can we apply this to ourselves as adults too?
Such a great question. So it can be really similar in a lot of ways. This is a lot of what I work on with clients, especially clients maybe who have been chronic dieters, excuse me, who have restricted and then maybe lost weight and gained weight a lot of times. We try to impose some kind of, I hate the word impose, we try to create some kind of frame, right? So that there's regular eating times with meals and snacks that have all the components so that our bodies can relearn how to eat. Like I was just talking with a client this morning, and she had brought up that sometimes she feels like a toddler relearning to eat. And I said, that's wonderful. I said, that's so great, because sometimes as toddlers and elementary school students ourselves, we didn't have an experience like this. We had a more erratic feeding or eating pattern, or didn't have access to food as readily, or any number of things that eroded our own hunger and fullness cues. So the goal is really to help reestablish the hunger and fullness cues. And we do it in the same way that we do for kids. We help reestablish the what, the when, and the where for us as adults. And that in turn allows our bodies to determine the if and how much. But it is very much like being a toddler and relearning to eat. It can feel almost infantile at times, but it's really useful. It's a great question.
Thank you. I think one point that you made that I was like, oh yeah, I love this. And so it was like the eating enough. And as adults, like obviously our needs change just like kids from day to day. And my thought process is the opposite, where I'm like, am I eating too much? But especially as a woman, like your needs and your cues are different from day to day. And I always ask myself of like, oh, why am I hungry already? But truly it's like your body needs it. And so kind of just the reframing.
Oh,
Um, we have a couple more questions. Um, is it okay for a child to come and go from the table while they're eating? Is it okay to make them hold still while eating?
mm. I would say holding still is near impossible for a lot of children. We're maybe asking them for something that developmentally just isn't possible. And if that's what helps them eat, if they leave and they go play with a toy and then come back and they eat some more, if it's during the time that the family is eating still, I would say go for it. Let's say you eat over the course of a half hour and the child is running to read a book and then come back and then goes to feed the fish and then comes back. Great. But then once that half hour is over, then mealtime is done. So whatever they can get in that half hour, awesome. And then we start to work with, oh wait, but mom, I'm still hungry. Yeah, I know, honey. So we'll have snack, we'll have bedtime snack in another hour and a half. And that's the kind of structure that allows them to unconsciously learn like, oh, if I want to get enough, probably can't go feed the fish and read my book and play with my toy. I have to stay and eat. It's not like we're saying this, these are unconscious things that they're learning if we can kind of adhere to a more of the structure.
Thank you. Okay, we'll take one last one. Do you have any tips on supporting healthy eating mindsets when a family has experienced food insecurity in the past, or I'm also potentially facing food insecurity, like with the times that might be that visible? So just any kind of
Insecurity. Yeah. We want to be a lot more slow with this process when there's been food insecurity in the past because it can take a really long time to retrain both the mind and the body to recognize that there's going to be enough. And this again, this can be true whether it's food insecurity because of socioeconomic status or access. It can be true even if someone's dieted when there is access to food, but the body doesn't know that there's access to food. All it knows is that it's being deprived. And so, whether it's from food insecurity or long term deprivation from dieting or both, we want to give a lot of time and just go really, really slow with retraining the body and mind to know that there's always going to be enough from now on. It is a slow process. It does not happen overnight. If you are implementing, let's say, the division of responsibility as a way to, reestablish the fact that there's going to be enough, just know that it might take a lot longer when there's been a history like what you describe than if there hasn't been, and just to give ourselves the time and the grace and like we talked about that pendulum, just know that that pendulum might swing longer, if there has been a history of food insecurity. It's going to take longer, and I think being able to weather that is challenging, and I would recommend having a professional assist.
Okay, thank you, Amy. I think that's all the time we have. Thank you for staying a little bit longer as well. Thank you for joining everyone, and please fill out the feedback form and then reach out to both Amy and I if there's any questions.
Thank you so much. This has been great.